Let me begin by disagreeing with you, if I may. I'm not certain that actually we can anticipate in the months and years to come that the ideas that informed a large part of the Bush administration are necessarily now defunct. And I think this is quite important because it seems to me the United States, in its vision of the outside world, combines two contradictory tendencies. On the one hand, there is the idea of American exceptionalism and isolationism, the sense that the United States is a very different place than elsewhere, and perhaps the sense that it shouldn't become involved in the problems of the wider world. An argument that, after all, goes back to George Washington. But at the same time, as part of that sense of exceptionalism, there is a vision of America as the essential nation. I quote Madeleine Albright. A state which must, because of its moral status, engage. And I think I would argue that that sense of engagement is part of a tradition that goes back to President Wilson almost 100 years ago, and also reflects the essence of the neoconservative idea. In other words, the neoconservatives were not the exception that they've been seen to be. And even if now they may be discomfited by their failures in Iraq and elsewhere, nonetheless their ideas are still there. And I think that President Obama, whatever his own personal views may be, whatever the coalition they have designed may be, has to live with that inheritance. And we shouldn't therefore assume that the principles that informed the Bush administration, however distorted they may have become, aren't going to be there in the future. So there is a continuity, and it may be a rather uncomfortable continuity that doesn't seem to reflect the rhetoric of the President himself. And I think we need to consider what that rhetoric really is, as articulated in the presidential campaign, and indeed as articulated subsequently with particular reference to the Middle East. The President made it clear that he wished in some way to change the relationship of the United States with the Middle East, and particularly with the two key issues in the Middle East, Iran and Israel. Alongside that, of course, there was the promise, which actually in some respects was an echo of the promise made by President Bush, of a final withdrawal from the issue of Iraq. Now, I would argue, I think, that the way in which the President articulated those two primary objectives of Iran and Israel said a lot about his sense of what the wider world now thought of American policy, but told us very little of what he actually intended to do. And my overriding feeling at the end of the presidential campaign, and it's been a feeling that's been reinforced in the last 200 days of his actual administration, was that I was looking at a man who was contemplative and who was highly pragmatic in the policy choices he would adopt. And that, I think, is what comes out of the three occasions when he's spoken primarily about the Middle East. The press conference shortly after he became president, the visit to Turkey about 3 months ago, and of course the Cairo speech at the beginning of June. He articulated a series of objectives. There was to be peace based on a two-state solution in the case of Israel and Palestine. There was to be an attempt to reach out to Iran, to embrace a state that he recognized as a key player inside the Middle East, and a state which the United States had ignored and rejected for the previous 30 years. And then there was to be an attempt to recover the prestige of the United States, damaged by the insensitivities and, how can I say, rather oafish behavior of the Bush administration, and an attempt to persuade the Middle East that the United States was not intrinsically hostile to it. But there was also a statement in that speech, in the Cairo speech at least, about the need for democratic governance. And that has for me an echo of the ideas of the neoconservatives and of ideas going much further back in the American foreign policy tradition. Now that's all very well, but I think to understand the implications of that, we need to consider two other things. What was the real audience for the Cairo speech, or indeed for the press conference, or indeed for the address in Turkey? There's an assumption that the audience was a Middle Eastern audience. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. It may also have been that the real audience was American, that the real purpose of the speeches was to persuade the American people that in some way the United States had restored a balance in its approach to the wider world, particularly to a world that was of acute significance to the United States itself, and that in a way, therefore, things were to return to normal. But the question is, what would be normal? Of course, before the Bush administration, normal in the 1990s meant American dominance, a unipolar world, the American century beginning, the idea that the United States would dominate a global economy and would in fact dispose of the problems of the Middle East as it wished. And those are the essential ideas of the Clinton administration. And against that is of course the idea that the real purpose is to persuade the United States population that in some ways the only real purpose of policy was to restore what had been lost. Now, I think we need to consider which of those two objectives was the real objective, is the real objective of the President's policies, and whether indeed either of them can be achieved before we can begin to consider the details of policy and where we're likely to go. I have to say that the idea of unipolarity seems to me today to be dead. It's dead in part because of the economic crisis that Stephen referred to, although it will take a very long time for that to manifest itself overtly inside American policy. But it's dead for another reason that also stems from the economic crisis. The evident engagement, in fact embrace, that the United States and China now demonstrate. The idea that China provides the funding to allow American consumption, and that thus what the Chinese may decide in the wider world has to be taken into account by any American administration. In other words, unipolarity has been replaced by at least duopolarity. Now, of course, it seems absurd to say that when you consider the size of the Chinese economy, or if you consider China's ability to articulate power. But it's not so absurd if you think in wider geopolitical terms, particularly if you recall that in the 2 years before the crisis emerged, at the end of the Bush administration, one of the striking features that affected the global economy was Chinese demand for resources, particularly for primary materials and for oil. And you'll remember the massive increase in oil prices, from which the Middle East benefited enormously, largely driven by perceptions of Chinese demand. And beyond that too, the actual pattern of Chinese policy, of engaging with those countries to supply the resources that they needed. And indeed, if China is now in that position, where because of its own imperious demand and because of its linkage in terms of trade and finance to the United States, it has to be a factor inside American foreign policy calculations, behind it lie India and Brazil. Now, of course, the current crisis is bound to downturn some of their expectations, but don't forget, those economies are not in recession. They're simply growing rather more slowly than they otherwise might. Russia, perhaps in the Middle East, because of its policies of the near abroad, might be a factor, and we'll see that perhaps better after the end of the President's visit to Russia, which is currently taking place.